Let us bow for a moment. Eternal God, our refuge and our strength in time of trouble, cut through the clutter now of our confusion and care. Make a space for that mind and mood which shall be strength and life. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. Once in a while a story comes along that speaks the old word to the moment so powerfully that one cannot resist passing it on. So let me begin with that story. On November 18th, 1995, Itzhak Perlman, the violinist, gave a concert at Avery Fisher Hall in that city, much on our minds and on our media. If you've ever been to a Perlman concert, you know that getting on stage is no small achievement for him. Stricken with polio as a child, he has braces on both legs and walks with the aid of 2 crutches. And to see him cross the stage one step at a time, slowly, is an unforgettable sight. He reaches his chair and then he sits down and slowly puts his crutches on the floor, and then he undoes the clasps on his legs and he tucks one foot back and pushes the other foot forward, and then he bends down and picks up the violin and puts it under his chin and proceeds to play. By now the audience is accustomed to this ritual, and they sit quietly while he makes his way across the stage to the chair. They remain reverently silent while he undoes the clasps on his legs, and they wait until he's ready to play. But the storyteller says this time something went wrong. Just as he finished the first few bars of the piece, one of the strings on his violin broke. You could hear it snap. It went off like gunfire across the auditorium. And there was no mistaking what that sound meant. There's no mistaking, at least in their minds, what he had to do. The people who were there that night thought to themselves, we figured he would have to get up, put the clasps back on again, pick up the crutches, limp his way off stage to find another violin. But he didn't. Instead, he waited a moment, he bowed his head and closed his eyes, and then he began to play again. He played with particular passion and power. Now, of course, anyone knows that it's impossible to play the kind of work he was playing with just 3 strings. I know that, you know that, but that night Itzhak Perlman refused to know that. The writer says you could see him modulating, changing, reworking the piece in his head. At one point it sounded between movements like he was retuning the strings to get new sounds out of them. And when he finished, there was an awesome silence in the hall. And then people rose and began to cheer. Extraordinary outburst of applause that came from every corner of the auditorium. We were all on our feet, screaming and cheering, doing everything we could to show how much we appreciated what he had done. But he smiled, wiped the sweat from his brow, raised his bow to quiet us, and then he said, not boastfully, but in a quiet, pensive, almost reverent tone, you know, sometimes it is the artist's task to find out how much music you can still make with what you have left. Disciples came to Jesus and said, this is a deserted place, the hour is now very late, send them away. But Jesus answered them, give them something to eat. And they said to him, are we going to go and buy with a year's wages worth of bread and give them to eat? And he said to them, what do you have left? How many loaves? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And you know the rest of the story. Of course, the story is a problem for the modern mind, isn't it? The critical scholars, the Jesus Seminar, for example, have a real problem with it. Typical university professors, they insist on being scientific about such stories. In their quest to find out what really happened and whether it happened, they've come up with some so-called scientific criteria as to the credibility of such an account. One of them is what they call multiple attestation, which means simply the more accounts we have of an event, the more likely it is to have happened. Now, why is this story a problem for them? It shows up in all 4 Gospels, but they still don't believe it. But it has been a favor of the church down through the ages. The little fellow said, I like best the story where everybody loafs and fishes. But the church has loved the story down through the ages because it is a story about how a good and loving God works in this difficult and suffering world. And to what end? And that is a terribly important question, is it not? How does God relate to his world? How does he work his will in this world? And to what end? Several clergy have been heard in the media recently suggesting that God was responsible for the World Trade Center tragedy. If you believe that, I submit you have a God who is a monster. Our story says that God works in his world in and through you and me. To what end? To the end that his kingdom may one day come on earth, a kingdom of love and peace and fish and bread. The work that God came in Jesus to do is a very down-to-earth work. It's doing what we can where we are to create a world of well-being where children are nurtured, where hungry are fed, where homeless are housed, where the good things of God's creation and our own can be shared and enjoyed by all. He said in his first sermon back in his home church, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free." And they ran him out of town. Too unbelievable a challenge, too crazy a mission for them. We need to be clear where this mission is for many of us now. Not all of us, but many. Not necessarily south of State Street or south of the Sahara. In our time, the poor and disadvantaged and suffering are served best by a growing economy and a quality education and a spirit of inclusion that enables as many as possible to share in it, both within and beyond our shores. You need to believe that as you go about your duties honestly and patiently and with vigor, as you generate and give your wealth, you do in fact multiply the possibilities for others to labor and enjoy. But God can only work in and through us if we're willing to embrace this challenge and this mission. Or to put it another way, we're inclined to let God work in our lives, enable God to work in our lives, only as we are willing to risk tasks that stretch us and that tire us and that challenge us and that scare us. If we retreat into lives that are safe and selfish, we can pretty well manage on our own, no doubt. A self-centered secular culture gets along without any serious attention to God. The kind of life, though, to which our faith calls us requires more wisdom, more strength, more courage, more hope than most of us can muster on our own. If you are confronted with possibilities that really challenge you, that scare you even, that's a pretty good sign that it is the call of God to you. I mean, the disciples ask in utter desperation and despair, where are we going to get a year's income to feed these thousands? But then there's another note that the story strikes. God tends to work most powerfully through those who are afflicted with handicaps or limitations or inadequacies, rather than through the brilliant, polished, confident, secure in themselves. And it's there over the whole story. Abraham was 75 years old before God got through to him and was able to do anything significant in his life, which has always been a great consolation to me. Moses, the great hero of faith, the friend of God as no other, stuttered and begged off on the rescue of his people. David was the runt of the litter, so unlikely a candidate for the throne that Jesse didn't even think to mention him to Samuel. When God accosts Jeremiah and tells him to go to the capital, he responds, Lord, you see, I don't even know how to speak. I'm only a kid. Look it up. And Peter, first Pope of the Church, suffered long with a streak of yellow and a bad case of foot-and-mouth disease. Even Jesus was handicapped. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth, born of one of the poorest backwater towns in the land, abandoned by his family who thought he was crazy, without credentials or pedigree, sets out to change the world. The story is true. Very often it is the less privileged or polished or pedigreed or those who have to deal with handicap or trouble or tragedy who in the long run are able to make the greatest impact upon our world for God and good. You wonder why? Well, perhaps it's because these are often more open to a dependency which makes them available to a strength which comes only from God. We have difficulty with dependency, don't we? We were raised to stand on our own 2 feet, and we've become proud and self-sufficient, and we prefer to believe that we can hack it on our own. I overhear 2 men at a lunch counter next to me up in Michigan. The one is saying, since his surgery, George has become a regular recluse. He no longer works, he won't go out in public, he just sits alone at home. The other responds, I sure wish he could use that cane and work around his limitation. A secular culture is a culture which thinks that it can get along without paying any serious attention to God. And it can. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. That sounds noble and heroic, but it doesn't cut it when the chips are down. And I think we learned that a little bit last week. It is when we as individuals and as a nation come up against our limits, our essential vulnerability, that we can become available to what God can do with us and with what we have left. Moses said, but God, suppose they won't believe me or listen to my words. And the Lord said, what is that in your hand? And Moses said, well, it's an old stick. A starving widow is confronted by the great prophet Elijah, upon whom the future of ethical monotheism is going to depend. And he says, bring me a scrap of bread. And she replies, I've only got a handful of meal. And Elijah assures her, don't be afraid, it'll be enough. In God's hands, it'll be enough. The disciples in despair ask how they can feed so many. And Jesus, in effect, asks, what have you got? What have you got? Same story. As we turn in dependency upon God, what we do have of wits or wealth or talent or determination is always enough. He can and does take it and work wonders in this world of healing and hope and creativity and future. He takes what we have left and he makes leftovers in abundance. Dependency can become our real strength. As the Apostle Paul learned to say, therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities, for the sake of Christ and his kingdom. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. This does not mean that God steps in and does life for us. Unfortunately, he doesn't, perhaps. Dependency upon God is no call for passivity. Don't work or worry, God will take care of everything. A young woman brings home her fiancé to meet the parents, and after dinner her mother tells her father to find out about this young man. So the father invites the fiancé into his study. So what are your plans? The father asked the young man. He said, well, right now I'm spending a lot of time studying the Bible. You know, it's a great book. Bible student, the father says, admirable, but what will you do to provide a nice home for my daughter, the sort she's accustomed to? Well, I'm still going to study a lot, the boy replies, but God will provide. And how will you buy her a beautiful engagement ring, such as she deserves? Asks the father. I'll concentrate on my study of the Bible, the young man replies, and God will provide. And children, asks the father, how will you support the children? Don't worry, sir, God will provide, replies the young fellow. Well, the conversation goes on in this vein, and each time the father questions, the pious young fellow insists, God will provide. Later the mother asks, how did it go, honey? The father answers, well, he has no jobs and no plans, but the good news is he thinks I'm God. Some days you need a laugh, don't you? Reality is, God does not do life for us. But when we turn to him aware of our limitations, aware that we are not God, and when we turn to him in dependency and need and trust, slowly but surely a special strength does come, the emotional and spiritual strength to act not out of our fears and anger, but out of wisdom and courage, the strength to do what has to be done, to embrace our life with equanimity and courage and hope. So does God do his work in this world through you and me, through us. My mind goes back to South African friends with whom we had dinner in Cape Town this past August, Doctors Yanni and Geraldine de Villiers. We know them only of 3 rather lengthy evenings together there over the years, and correspondence now and again. Their letter of last week concluded, "We're all shocked and saddened by the recent events in your country. In these difficult times, our thoughts and our prayers are with you all." The de Villiers French Huguenot family arrived at the Cape in the 1680s as de Villiers, but they quickly became de Villiers. They were Calvinists fleeing persecution in Europe. He finally gave up his gynecological practice a year ago at age 76. His wife Geraldine has recently retired from her practice as an internist. But Yanni served for many years as president of Stellenbosch University, one of the most prestigious universities in South Africa. And in that position, he fought for the rights of blacks and coloreds. He was a courageous force for the destruction of apartheid and is proud of it. He and Geraldine are worried right now about one daughter and son-in-law who farm in the province of the Free State because they have to sleep with pistols under both their pillows, since friends of theirs, a neighboring farm couple, were robbed and murdered recently. Over 1,000 farmers have been murdered in the past 10 years in South Africa. And he and Geraldine were in Cape Town after dark for the first time since they joined us for dinner 2 years ago. They live up the coast a little ways, but they would stay overnight with their other daughter in Cape Town before returning home up the coast in daylight the next day. Yanni's had quite a medical story. Quintuple bypass surgery for his heart a few years ago. He's recovering well from his 3rd bout with cancer. I know of these things because he has mentioned them in letters. Because he wrote me to assure me that he could survive because he had faith in God and in prayer. He's quite well recovered right now from a stroke that he had last fall. But you would never guess any of this from him and his manner and bearing. He's gracious, he's sunny of disposition, he's deeply involved in his church and their mission to try and help that incredibly poor and difficult country, to foster reconciliation and peace and future. And he and the family have no thought of leaving. Sitting beside me, he leaned over me at one point during dinner and said, almost in a whisper, but with a great smile, "I have faith in God. I'm a fighter." That's how God works in our world as we turn to him in the dependency of trust as his children and people. He takes what we have left of us and turns it into the strength to keep the faith, to fight the good fight, to finish the course. What more can we ask or need?